Welcome to the Transport and Climate Change Week, and welcome to our session. Next slide, please. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our event, which is titled as Which Data are Necessary for Baseline Development. Next slide, please. And it is organized by UN Climate Change and the UNFCCC IGS Regional Collaboration Center for Asia and Pacific in Bangkok. Next slide, please. Today, we have planned for 2 hours for our event. In the first hour, after our short introduction and welcome remarks, we will have 2 presentations. The first presentation is about the key outcomes of COP26 and tracking of progress of implementation and achievement of NDCs. And the second presentation is on the baseline development for the transport sector. After the 2 presentations, we will have about 20 minutes for the questions and answers. Then in the second hour, we will together work on a hands-on exercise and will develop a transport baseline together. Finally, we will wrap up the session by some remarks on the next steps and way forward. Next slide, please. Before we start, I would first like to give the floor to our distinguished speakers to introduce themselves. So first, yes, please.
Hello?
Hey. Yes.
Just myself or the welcoming remarks? I'm sorry, I'm not.
No, just quickly introduce myself.
Yeah. My name is Jens Raczynski. I'm the regional lead of the RCC Bangkok, the Regional Collaboration Center for Asia and the Pacific. And yeah, I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
Marlan, please.
Yes, so good morning, everyone. My name is Marlan Pillay, and I'm a program officer here at UNFCCC. Thank you.
Hedge, please.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Gajanana Hedge. I'm working with the mitigation program of the Climate Change Secretariat, and most of our work has been with setting standards for climate action. Thank you.
Thank you. And Eduardo, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Eduardo Cardoso. I, as Marlan and Gaj, I also work here in the UNFCCC Secretariat under Gaj's supervision. And thanks for the invitation.
Okay, last, it's me. I'm Ariel. I work for RCC Bangkok, and I'm a technical officer and also the moderator for today's session. Next slide, please. And also a few notes on the housekeeping rule. First, we would just wanted to inform you that our event will be recorded. And also, we would really encourage you to send your question in the chat box. So the right hand, there's the screenshot of the live stream platform. So you can just type your questions in the chat box. And then we will also share our presentations. And as I mentioned, that we will have a hands-on exercise. We also have some documents for the hands-on exercise. So the link to download the presentations and also the documents for the hands-on exercise will be shared in the chat box in a few minutes. We also highly encourage you to engage on social media using the hashtag, 2 hashtags. One is Transport Week 2020. And second is we change transport. And lastly, I just also wanted to remind you that during the break time, there will be transport lunch and you can meet colleagues via video chat. Without further ado, I will pass the floor to our first speaker. Next slide, please. and the Marlan will give us the presentation on key outcomes of COP26 and tracking of progress. Oh, sorry. Before that, we also have the opening remarks. So sorry, Jens, I saw your video is still on. So before we do the presentation, then I will first ask the Jens to give the opening remarks.
Yeah, that's totally fine, Ariel, because I'm going to be very short, but thank you very much for giving me the floor. And I just wanted to welcome our participants to this event, to this particular session on which data are necessary for baseline development as part of this Transport and Climate Week 2022. And I would also like to thank GIZ very much for inviting us to participate and to organize a session of this event. We're really delighted to do so. And yeah, the session that you're attending and participating in is co-organized by RCC Bangkok and our colleagues from the UN Climate Change Secretariat in Bonn. You've already briefly met our colleagues, Marlan, Gaj, Eduardo, Marlan from Transparency, Gaj and Eduardo from Mitigation Division. Just a very brief background of the RCC Bangkok, for those of you who don't know us. The UNFCCC IGES Regional Collaboration Center for Asia and the Pacific is one of 6 regional collaboration centers. It is hosted by our host partner IGES in Bangkok. We cover the geographical region from Asia, Central Asia, all the way to the Pacific Islands, and the center was opened in 2015. So while we are not working too much directly in transport in our region, we do work very closely with our colleagues, the subject matter experts who you have briefly met on transparency, Paris Agreement, Article 6 in particular, carbon pricing and other mitigation actions. And yeah, I want to keep it really short and give you more time with the colleagues. So I hope this session will be very interesting and useful for everyone. We're happy to answer questions, also contact us directly. And I'll just give back to you, Ariel, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jens, for introducing RCC, and also thank you for keeping your video on so that I don't skip the opening remarks. Okay, so with that, then we will directly move on to our first presentation. So next slide, I think. Yes. So please, Marlan, take the floor, please.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Yes, so today I'm going to present to you about the key outcomes that came out of the COP26 in Glasgow. And then I'm going to share with you some information on the tracking of the progress of implementation and achievement of NDCs. And we will relate it to the topic of transport. So next slide, please. Okay, so first I want to share with you what was the overall outcomes from the COP in Glasgow. And the first item that we have is on adaptation. And you will see that a work program was launched to define this global goal on adaptation, as well as to double the finance for adaptation. And parties also had a number of discussions on how to enhance the support on loss and damage. So the next was on climate finance. And there was parties addressed a need to improve the delivery of climate finance. So $100 billion between 2020 and 2025, and to initiate the process to define a new goal on finance post 2025. Then parties also identified a number of ways to close the emissions gap. So one was about the phasing down of coal and the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. The second was a number of sectoral pledges that was made to reduce emissions in various sectors. And pertinent to this Transport Climate Week is sectoral pressures to increase the amount of electric vehicles in the transport sector. And finally, there was this regular updating of the NDC synthesis report as new NDCs are coming in. Now, COP26 was also important in terms of closing the Paris Agreement rulebook. So a number of decisions and rules was needed, and that was concluded at this COP. One was about, in the transparency area, was about these common reporting tables and formats. And then the other was agreeing on common timeframes for NDCs, and then Article 6 on market-based mechanisms. Next slide, please. So you will see from COP26, there's a need for a lot of transformational action to take place. And that means not incremental, but transformational. And so countries will need to look at specific sectors and ask themselves, how can I transform this sector? What sort of plans, policies can I put in place to transform this sector as soon as possible, in line with the national climate change policy and NDC targets? And then what type of support will I need to implement those policies and plans? Now, when you have when you raise this ambition, would the modalities, procedures, and guidelines for the ETF available? Parties will begin to submit their first biennial transparency reports and their national inventory reports by latest 31st December 2024. So of course, LDCs and SIDS, they may submit at their discretion. And what continues will be what used to be under the BOR guidelines as well, which is submission of this annex on the technical analysis of REDD+ activities for results-based payments. Now, the ETF MPGs also talk about adaptation as well. And so to prevent duplication of effort, parties are able to submit their adaptation communication as a component of the BTR, but they need to identify the relevant part of that adaptation communication as it will meet the ETF MPG provisions. Now, within the ETF MPGs, there is also some flexibility provisions. And these flexibilities are available to those developing country parties that need it in light of their capacities. And so this application of this flexibility is to be determined by the country itself. And then it is not also subject to technical review process. So information on flexibility and improvements in reporting has to be provided as part of the BTR. So in other words, countries have to say why they are using specific flexibilities. Perhaps they have some capacity constraints, and they can identify that, and they can talk about the ways that they are going to improve their reporting over time. So what has come out from the COP26 as Decision 5 CMA 3, you will see there is now this outline of the Biennial Transparency report showing the different chapters. And then there's common reporting tables and formats for tracking progress of NDCs, for GHG emissions inventories, etc. And then there is also the training program for technical experts that is currently in development. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just the outline of the BTR. So you have the GHG inventory information in there. Then you have information on the progress made in implementing and achieving the NDCs. You could add information on climate change impacts and adaptation, and then the finance, technology transfer and capacity building support that is needed or was received by developing country parties. Then there's additional information when NCs and BTRs are submitted jointly. And of course, we talked about the flexibility and improvements in reporting and the annex. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we move on to this provision of NDC, provisions for NDCs. And what's stated in the ETF MPGs is that the reporting on the progress of implementation and achievement of NDC should facilitate this clear understanding of climate action, right? And then each party has to provide information to track the progress of their NDC implementation and achievement using this structured summary. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to information in the BTR on the NDC, there is a provision for the description of the NDC. And here you'll see that they ask for the targets, the target year and the period, the reference period, if there was a baseline or base year or starting point, and what were the values for that, and the time frames, and the scope and the coverage of the gases, and then whether there was any use of market-based mechanisms as part of that, and then any clarifications or updates. Now, when you apply this to you, if you have sectoral targets, like if you have a target specific to transport, then you would need to provide the information about if you use this baseline approach to provide information on the baseline and then on the measures that you've taken in the transport sector to reduce emissions. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so now I want to talk about a little bit on this projections of GHG emissions and removals. This is something that is required in terms of the ETF MBGs, but it's also closely related to the topic today, and you're going to see more of this with the presentation from Eduardo and Gaj. Now, when you make projections on your GHG emissions, come up with different scenarios, right? And what the requirement is asking is you describe the scenarios where you have a baseline GHG emissions, and then where you have without any measures. So if you had no measures to reduce the emissions, how would the trajectory look? And then if you had with the measures, and these measures is the currently implemented and adopted policies and measures that is in place in the country. So how would that look? And then if you took additional steps, additional measures, and these are just the adopted or planned measures, how would that look? So can you move to the next slide? Thank you. So you will see this graph, and in this graph, this is the hypothetical projection on the GHG emissions under different scenarios, and you will see firstly the actual emissions trend, and then you're going to see that if you implemented some measures, you're going to see some change, right? So this line is showing what were the expected effects if you implemented, if you have measures that you implemented. And so, for example, now here, they are showing the difference. So the actual effect between 2010 and 2015 in this shaded area. Now, if additional measures was taken, this will also drive down the emissions above what is already in place. Now, when you apply this in the transport sector, let's say you have this baseline of GHG emissions, and then you are projecting what will happen, and you are looking at different scenarios on what type of mitigation actions and policies you can take, and how that will reduce the emissions over time. And then what's important then in your BTR is to, as the years go by, is to provide the information on the tracking of the progress to achieve that specific transport sector NDC sectoral target. Next slide, please. So what I want to share with you here is, this is the general algorithm for tracking the progress of implementation and achievement of NDC. Now, when you have a target and you are tracking the progress, you need to have some sort of indicators to measure that progress. So you're going to have to look for what indicators will you use to come up with in the information that shows that you're actually achieving that NDC target that's been set, right? And then you need to provide this information as part of your BTR and provide details of it in the structured summary. Next slide, please. Now we have two documents that may be helpful to you to gain more understanding. One is on the CGE technical handbook on the implementation of the enhanced transparency framework. This document is available to you on our website. So the links are provided below, and it provides quite useful diagrams and information to facilitate your understanding of the ETF. Next slide, please. And the second document we have is the compendium on GHG baselines and monitoring. and this is specific to passenger and freight transport. So we cover a lot of tools used for climate change mitigation in transport sector, and we take you through using very visual aids, diagrams, flow charts, pictures, etc., to explain to you how to apply methodologies and tools for the transport sector. Now, we are also updating this manual. So in a few months' time, you will have on our website the updated version of this. So thank you very much. I hand over back to you, Kate.
All right, thank you so much, Marlan, for sharing the COP26 outcome and also giving us a very nice overview of the biennial transparency framework. I really encourage the participants and our colleagues just to send us the question in the chat box. After the second presentation, we will answer the questions for both presentations. So without further ado, let's move on to the second presentation. Next slide, please. And I would like to invite Gaj for giving us the presentation on baseline developments for the transport sector. Gaj, please take the floor.
Thank you, Ariel. Good morning, good afternoon again, everyone. Thanks, Marlan, for introducing the outcomes of COP26 and also the trajectory which the world needs to see, and currently what's happening in the business as usual scenario. Here we go a little deeper into baseline issues, but before that we also look at the bigger picture and what needs to transform and what it means, what are the opportunities and what are the challenges in particular to the transport sector. Next slide, please. This is just a quick illustration of what needs to change over to 2050 to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. You all have heard about this. But from a business perspective, what it would cost and what it could bring. So as you can see here, 85% of today's emissions are from energy usage, and 19% of which is from the transport sector. And if you look into the transport sector more closely, then it's 75% of that emissions come from road transport, 13% from aviation, 11% from maritime transport, and 1% from rail, and less than 1% from other sources. So what it would take to achieve this net zero in terms of the investment, in terms of what needs to happen from the business community. So currently something like 6 trillion is being spent on capital assets, including roads and other infrastructure. That needs to go to 9.2 trillion, almost 30% increase. And this needs to happen for next 30 years. That's the kind of transformation which would be needed to achieve the net zero. And just to give a perspective, this is equivalent to half of all the current annual corporate profits. Next slide, please. So what's happening in the transport sector? As you can see here, over the last 3 decades, the emissions have been growing almost every 10 years. It seems like it's growing almost 50% or even more. And here, particularly the road transport emissions have grown very significantly from something like 5 gigatons in 1990 to close to 8 or 9 gigatons in 2019. You can also see some increase in the shipping and aviation sector as well, but the biggest increase has been in the road sector. Next slide, please. Not only that, the demand for passenger and freight transport is increasing, and it's projected to increase dramatically until 2050, almost from what seems to be 40,000 billions of passenger kilometers in 2020. It goes to 120,000 by 2050. So it's a huge increase. It was increasing, and the future is projected to increase. And then what it means for the emissions. Next slide, please. So yeah, all of this puts a lot of expectation, a lot of pressure on this sector to achieve the emission reductions. And is there anything being done? Indeed, there are many measures being undertaken. And as you can see here, quite a few measures have been listed. And then in fact, the almost 400 billion in investment over the last several years has happened. And also both in the European Union, in the US, and in many other countries, in China, and in many countries of Asia, almost everywhere, measures have been announced. In fact, here some examples are there. EU has proposed to target to cut average emissions from new car by 55% before 2030, and US government called for nets for zero emission vehicles to make up half of all new passenger car and light truck sales by 2030. Several countries have also brought forward timelines for bans on sales of new vehicles with internal combustion engines, which are diesel and petrol engines. And many of them also provide subsidies for low emission vehicles. It is, many measures are being taken, but given the scale of the issue, it is still not sufficient. The scale up would be required. Next slide, please. Here, a little bit into the NDCs, which Marlan also referred. They are being submitted every 5 years with more ambition every time. And in the latest synthesis report, it's seen that parties have included many measures in the transport sector, but the road measures in the road transport leads with 65% of the parties indicating one or the other measure. Something like 16% is the rail related measures indicated in NDCs. Shipping is 10%, and it's also aviation 6%, and then there is cross-cutting measures which nearly account for 40%. The typical measures include energy efficiency improvements and shift to more efficient modes of transport, electrification, and shift to low or zero carbon fuels. Next slide, please. But what this means for 2050, as Marlan already alluded to, the proposed measures are not sufficient to meet the 2050 targets. Much more is needed. But here is a depiction of what is needed. If we need to hit contribution from the transport sector for 2050 net zero, then beginning from something like 2025 till 2040, most of the internal combustion engine vehicles have to stop coming into the market, and then those have to be taken by battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. Ariel, I don't see the next slide. Can you move? Yeah, now what does that mean for us and for the transport sector, and especially if we focus on the estimation of greenhouse gases? This means to be able to track the progress and to be able to see where we stand with our own targets. Then it becomes very, very important that there is a greenhouse gas estimation, the transport sector, which is reliable and which is comparable across different players and in the industry, but also from across the countries as well. So if we look into more closely, what are the methods here? There are basically two approaches. One is to take a very comprehensive approach, the life cycle estimation from cradle to grave of using the vehicles, and also accounting for the fuels. The other approach is so-called well-to-wheel or well-to-tank approaches, which is normally the approach which has been used in the carbon markets for majority of the cases. So well-to-wheel comprises of well-to-tank emissions and tank-to-wheel emissions. So tank-to-wheel emissions is like tailpipe emissions, which is related to combustion of the fuel, but also some fugitive escape of the fuels. It is a sort of a limited approach, and majority of the methodologies under the CDM or in the transport sector carbon markets took that approach, because then you would also have other emissions both in the project and baseline, so that from that perspective it was kept simple. But also going forward, there is a need to look more closely into this. So we need to also look into tank to wheel emissions, of course, but also consider what happens upstreams before even these fuels are used in the vehicles. So there comes the well to tank emissions from the oil extraction, refining to distribution. There are emissions and they cannot be ignored. And if you look at biofuels, the growing of feedstock, transforming them into biofuels and transporting to the pump, they all have to be accounted for a more accurate consideration. And same with electricity, you need to generate electricity, transmit, and you have to charge the vehicles. And with hydrogen, again, you have to produce, transport, and distribute the hydrogen at a very high pressure, because it can't be done like a normal fossil fuel. It needs 900 bar pressure to be able to be transported. So as I said, life cycle assessment takes a more comprehensive approach. It also considers, besides the well-to-wheel emissions, it also considers the sourcing, altering, and incorporating materials into the final product. If you take the example of car, you have to consider the emissions of the production of the car from the engine, drivetrain, and battery or fuel cell, whatever that have been used. And also whatever emissions that happen in the end disposal of the vehicle. So these are at a high level two approaches. And then as I mentioned, so far mostly tank to wheel or well to tank plus tank to wheel emissions. Those were considered under the carbon markets, but going forward things may change. Next slide, please. So here just a simple illustration to drive home that it's not simply enough to choose a technology which may be better than internal combustion engine. As you can see at the leftmost, the red dots are the world average emissions from different types of vehicles. ICE stands for internal combustion engine, diesel or petrol, and the other four to the right are alternatives. Plug-in back. Can you stay in that slide? This could be plug-in hybrid or battery electric vehicle or fossil fuel cell vehicles to the extreme right. And the important thing here is you have the world average emissions, but also range of emissions, which are dependent on the site. Because if you look at electricity usage for electric vehicles, if your vehicle is located in, for example, in Scandinavia, in Norway, the emissions from electricity is almost zero, because mostly it's coming from hydro. But again, if that vehicle is located in another country with a lot of coal in the grid, maybe, for example, South Africa or Zimbabwe, then the emissions may be quite high and comparable to what happens with fossil fuel vehicles, petrol or diesel. And the case is even more stringent in the case of hydrogen, because if only green hydrogen, you are assured of emission reduction. But if you go for gray or blue hydrogen, it's possible that the emissions could be even higher than the internal combustion engine. So it's not simply enough to look at the technology, but also you have to look at the source of the fuel, and then what I mentioned as the upstream emissions. So you have to take all of that into context to calculate reliably the emission reductions. Next slide, please. As I mentioned so far, generally the carbon markets have bypassed the issue of the emissions related to production, which may be okay, or it was okay till now, because as you can see here, till now the material related emissions were small on a relative basis as compared to the other emissions, 80 to 20 roughly. But going forward, as we reduce other emissions, the emissions related to the production of the vehicle itself become significant. And in fact, by 2030, it is projected that 35% of the emissions happens from the production of the vehicles. And by 2040, it even gets higher share at 60%. So this is an issue which will gain more prominence going forward. Maybe not all methodologies currently address it, but you have to keep that in mind, and the future things can change. Next slide, please. So coming back to our issue of baseline, why it's important, because as I mentioned, there are many methods to estimate emission reductions. And then similarly, there are many methods to see what would have happened in the absence of the project. So that's why it's important to have a reliable and consistent and comparable method for the baseline. So that will be the focus of the next session and the exercise Eduardo will take you through. But you have to keep all of this aspects in mind, that there will be more and more requirement to have a reliable calculation of emission reductions, and in that the baseline plays a significant role. Because if you choose the baseline in a wrong way, the estimation of emission reduction will not be reliable. Okay, next slide, please. Marlan already referred to this. There is very good guidance in this document compendium on GHG baselines and monitoring for transport. And as he mentioned, it will also be updated. But indeed, it's a good source for you to get started with. Can you go to the next slide? So it includes some very simple approaches, the so-called tier 1 approach, which will be high level consideration of fuel usage and its emission factor, which is probably okay for inventories in some specific context, but ideally the more rigorous method should be adopted. Next slide, please. So the guidelines also refers to tier 2 method, which is more which requires more data, but which will also be more accurate. It's so-called ASIF model is adopted, where you bring the activity data, which may be the kilometer of travel, and a share of different modes, and the intensity of fuel use, and then the emission factor of the fuel. Taking all of this into account, it will give a more accurate picture. But also, as I mentioned, there may be instances where you have to go even beyond this to look at upstream emissions, what happens before the fuel is brought to the vehicle, and also the emissions related to the production of the vehicle itself. So, but that's for the future. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think that's in a nutshell, a quick introduction to the importance of baseline, and then my colleague Eduardo will introduce you to the more deeper aspects of the baseline, and also we have a specific exercise to take you through to drive across some of the key issues regarding that. Thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Ariel.
Thank you so much, Gaj, for sharing with us the significance of transport sector in NDC and also in the net zero transition. and also for sharing with us the methods for estimating emissions and developing baseline in the transport sector. So now we will move to the to Q&A first before we will work on the hands-on exercise. So we have received some questions. First, I have two questions for Marlan. Marlan, the first question asked about how is the submission of an NDC under Article 4 related to the enhanced transparency framework? Marlan, could you please turn on your video and also answer the question?
Yes, sorry, my computer was acting a bit. So how does the NDC? So your NDC under Article 4 is communicated by parties every 5 years, right? Now it is not subject to review under the ETF, but what is subject to review is the tracking of the progress made in your NDC, where you put it into your structured summary. So that will be what is reviewed by the technical expert review team. But your NDC always remains self-determined by the country, and so the adequacy and appropriateness of the NDC is not reviewed, but you need to report on the progress in implementing and achieving the NDC. So this is important because this information also will be used together with your NDC as inputs towards the global stock take, which is important so that we know globally how everyone is doing in meeting the goal of the Paris Agreement to reduce those emissions and maintain, get in line with this 1.5 degree or 2 degree goal. So thank you, Yuking.
Okay, indeed, Marlan, there's a second question for you. The second question asked what will happen with the national communications once biannual transparency reports are submitted?
Okay, so your national communication is part of the Climate Change Convention, right? And this is not being replaced by the Biennial Transparency Report. Now, you will continue submitting national communications every 4 years. And when the time frame coincides with your submission of your Biennial Transparency Report, then you can decide to send one report that meets both the ETF MPG provisions as well as the national communication guidelines for a national communication. So it can be submitted as one document during those periods of time. So thank you, Yuking. But I want to just talk a little bit about the presentation that Gaj shared, and he shared quite some important statistics there about what should happen in the transport sector between now and 2030. And you can see that there is an importance to look at the transformational actions that will be needed in the transport sector. Now, when you take transformational action, yes, it's going to be quite disruptive, and you're going to have there's lots of planning that needs to be done, and lots of discussions with the relevant stakeholders to put those policies and measures that you want to put in place, and other things like response measures, the impact of those mitigation actions that you want to take in the transport sector, that will also need to be factored into it, as how it affects the labor and all the people, the different tiers of in the transport sector, from manufacturing to freight transport, etc. Now, another thing that I wanted to just highlight is that although our presentation is looking at these GHG emissions and mitigation, there is also the aspect of adaptation in the transport sector. And that's quite important as well, because a lot of the infrastructure around transport would be susceptible to extreme weather events, and so the transport sector also needs to think, people in the transport sector would also need to think about how to put forward plans and measures for adaptation, addressing adaptation in the transport sector. Thank you, Yuking.
Thank you so much, Marlan, for answering questions and also for your comments on transformational action and response measures, as well as highlighting the importance of considering adaptation measures in the transport sector. Okay, then I've also received some questions for Gaj. Gaj, the first question indeed is about, I think if I understood the question correctly, is about the emission factor of the electricity. So I will just read out the questions asking, are there any methods for estimating the carbon proof of electricity produced in a country in the absence of relevant data on CO2 emissions of electricity produced in that country? So Gaj, please take the floor.
Thank you, Ariel. I think it's a very, very important question. There are different sources. My colleague already listed two here. One is the IGES, which Ariel can refer to. They list all the grid factors used in the CDM projects. The only drawback here is they have to draw the information from the projects of CDM, and then these factors could come from different vintage of data or from different periods, depending on when they were hosted. But there is also another source, which is maintained by international financial institutions, technical working group on GHG harmonization, which includes all the multilateral development banks like World Bank, ADB, and others. They have a consistent methods with which they produce data for every country. It is the data itself is bases quite a bit on the data provided by International Energy Agency, but also it takes into account to some extent what needs to happen in the context of declared policies under NDCs. So it's a good effort, I would say, in terms of providing a consistent number across for many countries, and you are welcome to look into this number as well. So there are multiple options, as I mentioned, to source the data on the grid emission factor.
Okay, thank you, Gaj, for the answer, and also thank a lot, Kenji, for already sharing the links to the documents in the chat. Gaj, there's indeed a second question for you. So the second question asks about the introducing electric vehicles. So it asked how the baseline would be set if the country intends to introduce electric vehicles.
Yeah, this, as I mentioned, depends really in what context you are setting the baseline. The baseline for the country inventory or country BTRs is different to what is done under carbon markets. If you are engaging in the Article 6, then you have to look into the specific method that will be applied. My colleague, maybe he will elaborate more in the next session, but as I mentioned, there are two different approaches. You can simply stay at the level of fuel usage by the vehicles in the baseline versus electricity usage in the project and then calculate the difference. But also you can go deeper into the issue, take the life cycle approach and then estimate more accurately. But I think my colleague will go deeper into that particular example, so you will hear more. But these are generally the two approaches. One, to look at the baseline consumption of fossil fuel and then look at the electricity consumption in the project. There are also methods which work backward from the electricity used for the vehicles and then look at what would have been the emissions for that. So all those different approaches will be covered by my colleague in the next session in a bit more detailed way.
Gaj, indeed, there's one more question for you. It's about the CDM transition. So the questions ask, can you please update on the transition process for CDM projects?
Yeah, I think indeed, yeah, it's also a very important question because going forward, there is considerable effort required to transition the existing CDM projects into the new system. There is, good news is the COP and CMA have already given guidance with regard to the transition. Some deadlines have been set to submit the project documentation for transition, which is around 23. My colleague Eduardo can go deeper into that. But also there is some work to be done by the supervisory body for the Article 6 mechanism to look into existing methodologies and then transform those methodologies which are compatible for Article 6 work. So both needs to happen. When these methodologies are transformed, there will be a bit more requirement included there. And then while transitioning, those methodologies have to be applied. And then there is also some provision to use existing methodologies till 2025. But there are multiple streams of work which are happening to be able to do this transition. And then you can expect more information to come in this area from the Regional Collaboration Center and also from us here. Thank you, Ariel.
Okay, more question coming, Dutch. I cannot let you go. And the question asked how to consider extraordinary events such as COVID crisis or disaster in baseline developments.
Yeah, that's also a very important question because, as I mentioned in the past, generally the trend or the approach taken in the methodologies of carbon markets was to look backward, look at what has happened over the last 1 year or last 3 years and set the baseline. This would, in the context of COVID, would give a different picture because if in a country due to COVID there was little transportation happening, then you get a false picture that the emissions were very low. But under the Article 6, there are different provisions on top of the existing methods. There is also the requirement to look into best available technology in the area. Also use a benchmarking approach to look at the stock of current vehicles and then look at their emissions and take the more efficient among them. And also there is a third approach based on the NDC trajectory. So all of this have to be factored into the baseline. So that might already address some of these issues which might come from the COVID issue, where you would have a baseline which looks very low because the activity was very low in that period. But I think going forward with the new methods being introduced under Article 6, some of this will also be addressed. Ariel, back to you.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
As I don't see more question coming, so I would wanted just to wrap up this session by thanking both speakers for very comprehensive presentations and also for answering all the questions, and also of course wanted to send the participant to send us the questions. Now we would like to move on to the second part of our event, which is the hands-on exercise. We noticed that some of the participants have already joined us through the Zoom link on the Zoom platform if you wanted to have more interactive features. But on the other hand, a majority of the participants still staying on this live streaming platform. That's totally fine. So if you just wanted to stay at the live streaming platform, just feel free to do so. Our trainer will be able to walk us through the training exercise, and you don't need to transfer to the Zoom platform. So without further ado, I will hand the floor to Eduardo for giving us the hands-on exercise guidance. Eduardo, please take the floor.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ariel, and good afternoon, everyone. Just before we enter in the hands-on exercise, I just want to spend some minutes presenting some approaches and options to set and define the baseline. Next slide, please. Okay, let's take a look at this graphic where in red we have the historical emissions of CO2, which are measured and reported over the years until a country decides in 2022 to implement a mitigation action. 2022 is known as the year when the historical emissions are ruptured. It's the year when the rupture takes place, meaning whatever is measured after 2022, 2023 and beyond will be a result of the mitigation action itself. But to conclude whether and how efficient the action was, the results have to be compared against a scenario where the mitigation would not have happened, which you call the baseline scenario. You can see here on the graphic that a baseline scenario could be determined based on different inputs and assumptions, and more than one possibility could take place. For example, an increase in the population, in the number of inhabitants, would lead to an increase in the demand for public transport, which consequently could lead to an increase in the emissions. Or another example, there is an increase in the GDP per capita of a country, which will allow the inhabitants to buy a car, avoiding the travel through public transport, and consequently increasing the emission reductions. But now, out of these options, is it okay to set a correct baseline? Since it's only possible to estimate and not measure what would have happened in the absence of the mitigation options, in the absence of the project, the baseline should be assessed as the most appropriate, meaning a realistic scenario that can accurately and conservatively represent what would have happened in the absence of the mitigation measure. So next slide, please. Yeah, so once, back to the previous one. So once the most appropriate baseline scenario has been set, emission reductions are calculated. Emission reductions are calculated based on the difference between the baseline emissions and the measured emissions. Next slide. And you can see also here that, you can see also here that the baseline is no longer a straight line. The baseline is a variation, varies along with the project emissions, because the circumstances where the baseline was set will change over the course of the project. For example, demand for transport may increase in the future, may vary according to the GDP, or according to the construction of new infrastructure, etc. Next slide, please. Now, there are different ways to set up and update the baseline. For example, baseline could be set and updated based on indicators such as economic growth, cost of fuel, populational growth, subsidies, a different transport tariff, etc. And this key information is used to feed a computer model that simulates the output, and which is usually required for the transport sector is the demand for passenger in case of public transportation and cargo in case of freight transportation. But could also be how the sales of vehicles will behave in the future, and all this could be converted into emission. Another example would be to determine the historical trends and assume that these trends will continue in the future, which is referred as a business as usual practice or business as usual scenario. And just assuming that the population will continue to travel under the same transport mode. Next, the baseline scenario could be set based on a specific course of action, such as the adoption of strategies and policies by a project. For example, the project sets that only sales of natural gas will be allowed, therefore the baseline will be the use of natural gas vehicles in a country or in a city or in the region. There's also an option of control group. This is a bit more complicated because you have to identify a population with similar characteristics such as socioeconomic, geography, climate, transportation services, profiles, etc. Could be to cities. In one of the cities, the population does not receive the mitigation measure, and the project will be implemented in another city where the emission reductions will take place. Next one, please. Then another option would be to conduct surveys with, for example, the users of a public transport system to identify the travel behavior, meaning identify how the user of a BRT corridor or a subway would have traveled in the absence of the BRT or the subway. For example, they would travel using regular bus lines, using taxis, using bicycles, regular vehicles, motorcycles, etc. And in this question, it's a matter of measuring the behavior of the user, which may have some implications, but it's a good proxy to set the baseline for public transportation projects. Next, another option will be based on the best available technology, which is by identifying which is the technology that represents the most efficient in terms of, for example, emissions, or in terms of kilometers traveled by liter or by ton of fuel, or based on the top most used efficient vehicles in a certain region. Next will be the best performing comparable activities, which would be the use of average emissions, provided that these activities are comparable and provide similar outputs and services. For example, in similar socio-economic, environmental, and technology circumstances. Next slide, please. Once the approach, one approach that has been widely used and that we are going to use in the hands-on exercise by crediting mechanism is to set the baseline through surveys of passengers and users of the public transportations. And in this option, the baseline emissions will be determined based on the monitored amount of passengers that are using the infrastructure in the scenario. For example, users of the subway or the BRT, and meaning that the baseline is determined ex post or dynamically. For every passenger kilometer traveled, there will be a specific emission factor associated with the passenger. Next slide, please. There is one tool that has been widely applied by the Clean Development Mechanism, which is specifically developed to set the baseline emissions, but this is specific for projects that involve the deployment of an infrastructure such as subways or BRTs or tram lines, etc. It provides guidance on how to set the baseline and how to calculate the baseline emissions. Next slide, please. Now, if you take, for example, this is not the case of the exercise, but let's take the 218. According to the tool, the baseline is determined by conducting a passenger survey after this new subway line enters in operations to determine how the passengers would have traveled between its origin and the final destination, which includes the modes that would have been used and the distance traveled. This information is converted into CO2 emission factor per passenger kilometer for the different transportations mode that will have been used by the passenger. It could be the specific CO2 emission factor per passenger kilometer by traveling by bus or by bicycle or by car, etc. Next slide, please. Now, baseline emissions for each of the modes is then calculated as the product between this emission factor set via the survey, the average distance traveled by each passenger, which is also set through the survey, the share of the passengers that would have used the different baseline modes in the absence of the BRT or the subway line, and the number of passengers that traveled in the project scenario, in the project infrastructure, such as the subway or the bus. Next slide, please. So let's say, for example, that the outcome of the survey identified that 70% of the interviewed passengers would have traveled by 20 kilometers using bus, and 30% of the passengers would have traveled by 30 kilometers using a conventional car. Next one. Yep. Going to the ASIF model that Gaj explained in his presentation, where A represents the activity in passenger kilometers, S represents the share of the travel made by the different modes, I, the intensity of the fuel of that specific transport mode, and F, the fuel type. Next one, please. We get that the activity is determined based on the number of passengers that are measured or that are determined exposed during the operation of the subway line, and the average distance traveled by the passenger determined through the survey. The S, which would represent the share of the travels during in the different transport modes, would be determined through the survey, you can see in red, and the intensity, meaning the specific fuel consumption of the different vehicles modes, and the fuel emission factor, they could be determined, for example, based on national statistics, based on specific studies, or they can be taken, for example, from the IPCC or from the vehicle manufacturer. And then applying the ASIF model, we calculate the baseline emissions in the absence of the subway line, how much CO2 would be emitted if the passengers would not have traveled using the subway line. Now, next one. So now going to specifically on the hands-on exercise. Let's assume that a multilateral development bank wants to invest in a new BRT line and would like to determine the emission reductions to include in its portfolio, the emission reductions of this new BRT line. You are hired as an expert in the transport sector to determine the baseline emissions. Now, to undertake this task, you decided that the best approach to set the baseline would be to conduct a survey. Your specific tasks in this exercise would be first to elaborate which questions will need to be asked to passengers in the survey. Next, bear in mind that some parameters, they are not necessarily captured by the survey. They can be sourced somewhere else. Which would be this information and how they would be captured? After you design the survey, you come with the answer for these two questions. It's interesting to discuss any specific conditions to apply the survey. For example, number of interviews or location of the interviews where you are going to interview the passengers. And the last task would be to calculate the baseline emissions using the ASIF model and the results of the survey. We have a dummy survey, a fake survey ready for you to be shared. But first, before doing so, I would like to hear some proposals or some answers about the first two questions. What would you ask the passengers in the questionnaire, in the interviews, and which would be the parameters that don't necessarily have to be captured in the survey? And for these specific parameters, how would you source them? Ariel, I'm not sure. I think the hands option and the microphones, I'm not sure if they are allowed for participants here in the session or not. We could use this option, or we could also use the chat option, and we can hear some proposals from participants.
Yes. So if the participants, you already joining us at the Zoom platform, you will be able to speak. Basically raise your hand and we will give the floor for you to speak. But if you still stay on the live streaming platform, then unfortunately you can only watch and then type the questions. So if the participants, if you wanted to take the floor to speak, I would encourage you to transfer to the Zoom platform and raise your hand, and then I will give the floor to you. But meanwhile, we already also share in the chat the link to download this document for this hands-on exercise. And maybe before letting the participants work on the exercise, so we do receive a question for you, Eduardo, in the chat. I think at the very beginning, when you introduce how to define the baseline, you mentioned like baseline 1, emissions from baseline 1 and baseline 2. So the question asks which year does this baseline 2 refers to?
Okay, the baseline emissions, the option 2, refer to 2022. It means if the BRT system or if the mitigation option was not implemented, then baseline emissions will continue to follow a historical path, for example. So the reference year will be 2022. Sorry, will be the historical prior to 2022.
Okay, thank you for the answer. And then that's okay. Marlan has his hand up. So Marlan, please feel free to take the floor.
Yes, just to kick off the questions that Eduardo asked. So question that need to be asked to the passengers would be, to me, frequency of travel.
Great, thank you, Marlan. Any other volunteers to answer Eduardo's question?
Just some initial guidance. If you want to set the baseline, you want to know how the passenger would have traveled in the absence of this new BRT line. Think about it. What would you ask the passengers to get information to feed the ASIF model?
All right, so I see a hand up. Sukuma, if I pronounce your name correctly, just feel free to take the floor.
Okay, thank you, Ariel. So I would like to try to answer this question. So I think we should know what kind of modes they will take if there is no BRT. So we can also like calculate what kind of the fuel they use and how far they will use the mode to go to their destination. Thank you.
So thank you. I understand you would ask which would be the modes of transport, how far, meaning the distance they would use under each mode and the type of fuel used, consumed,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Okay. Any volunteers? Okay, that is quite correct. That's the basic type of information you would capture. You can ask the passenger, for example, where are you starting your trip and where are you going? Where are you entering the BRT line and where are you dropping off? And in the absence of the BRT line, how would you have traveled? Would you use part of the trip using a bicycle, part of the trip using a motorcycle, part of the trip using a car? There's no right, there's no correct or incorrect answer. Depends for each passenger, depends on the combination of modes and distance they use. Based on the fuel, yes, that's one type of information you can capture on the survey, but just assume that the person, for example, uses its personal car plus 2 or 3 bus lines. They would need to know the type of fuel, or a taxi, for example. They would need to know if the taxi consumes gasoline or diesel or natural gas. Perhaps this is something that can be sourced from transport statistics, this type of information. But the first one, the modes of transport and the distance travel, yes, for sure, would be taken from the survey. Any other proposal?
Great. First, indeed, I saw Anna's hand first, but she lowered her hand down, but now she raised her hand up. So I will just give the floor first to Anna and then followed by Seti. Sorry if I pronounce your name not correctly. So Anna, please take the floor first. Anna, will you be able to?
Hello?
Yes.
You hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, thank you so much. So I think that the first question that we have to, because I think that the survey must follow some schema to determine our quantitative variables or qualitative variables that we need to study to give this result. So I think that we need to start by classifying people or the passenger subject of the survey by trying to know the demand or their demand of transportation, so we can identify exactly if this passenger is a user of transport or if he's a big user of transport tools in his way or his project or not. So this is the first thing that we need to do. How many times you use transportation by day, or are you using every day, or how many times you use transportation tools or mode by day. So this is the first question. Second question is maybe we need to know more about his preference, which way you prefer to use first. If you have to choose between this transportation mode or this transportation mode, which one you will choose at first? Then we can follow those two questions by asking more information about the distance that he need to use every day, and etc. etc. So I think that the first part or the first stage is to classify all the passengers subject to the survey, try to have some idea about the choice, and then we can have other question about more specific aspects quantitative or qualitative aspects. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's quite well captured. Thanks. Meaning we would determine, for example, an average emission factor per passenger, depending on specific circumstances. He could 90% of the chances of using the car, and 5% using a motorcycle, and 5% using a regular bus line, for example, right?
Yes, exactly. So if we classified passengers, we can have a deep idea or a more accurate idea about each category of the passengers. So if we quantify the impact on the gas emission, we will have a proportional impact, and which is more near the reality.
Yeah, no, you are absolutely correct. The big point about the survey is that we are trying to capture, since conducting the interview, we usually take the passengers on a rush, trying to switch from, for example, from bus to subway, or rushing towards its work, or rushing towards meal, whatever. The questions would need to be somehow simpler. I fully understand your point. I fully agree with your point that we should get a historical of the passenger, which would be their preferences, etc. But when designing the survey, and that we step already inside in the third question, try to be as brief as possible, or try to get an information that is easy and is at hand for the interviewer. Because you don't want him to waste his time or walking, or you don't want to leave the place where you're doing the interview. Otherwise, you can lose some other passengers to do the interview. But yes, I completely understand that would be the ideal to get its behavior and preference. And I think, yes, with these answers, I think we captured the basic factors that should be covered by a survey. Now about what is not covered necessarily by a survey. Can you please go one slide back to the ASIF model? Yeah, there it is. I gave you there are some hints here already. What is green? What should be captured? What should be answered by passenger S? What should be estimated either based on statistics or even based on a specific survey, for example, of occupancy of vehicles. And what is in blue is what you can take from national statistics or sector statistics. For example, the specific fuel consumption of vehicles, of buses or cars, you can take it from the manufacturer. You can determine, for example, the composition of the fleet in a certain city or a certain region, and based on the composition of the fleet, you calculate the average fuel consumption in liters per 100 kilometers, or in grams of fuel per liters. That should be fine. Also, the F, which is the CO2 emission factor per unit of fuel consumed, it can be made available by the supplier, by the manufacturer of the fuel, or be available in the national energetic balances, or last option will be to take the full values from the guidelines from the IPCC to prepare the national greenhouse gas inventories. Okay, let's move to the next slide again. Yeah, perfect. Let's go to the third question. One point flagged by Annan is to check the preferences of the user. Yes, this can be a very important question, but bear in mind that passengers may be on a rush to get somewhere else, and they might not have time to think about travel. 70% of my possibilities would be to use the car, and 20% to use the bus, etc. What else would you assume, would you consider to conduct the survey? Remember, you are interviewing passengers. when you deploy a survey, implement a survey, you want to have the most representative, the passengers that are close, that represent as close as possible the full population. Any hints?
Eduardo,
Yes.
indeed, I saw Ankit said raised hand for quite a while and then now lowered the hand and add a comment in the chat. So I just wanted to know whether Ankit, do you still wanted to take the floor for your comment?
Yeah. So, just before that, I'm really sorry, I can't see the hands raised option here in my screen.
Oh, that's fine. No, yes. Okay, so Ankit, please take the floor.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. I was just raised my hand regarding the first two questions that Cardoso has asked. So it's regarding the second one is can be the net calorific value and the emission vector can be taken on the secondary sources like IPCC report or something or national statistics report because these are something which you don't need to survey. So that I think is can be the answer for the second question. And the first already a lot of replies have been come and the same replies from myself also that we have to ask the mode by which they have traveled from their home to a station and then out from a station to a destination. And the second thing can be if this project is not there, right? If it in the absence of this project activity, how they traveled usually through this route. And the third thing can be the distance they traveled, and the fourth thing can be the socio-demographic profile also. And the last thing could be it should be very short and crispy. So because you don't get much more time in this, right? It's a floating passengers and you don't have much more time to ask or interview them. You have to be very, really quick in this scenario. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the answers covered everything. Yeah, so I think we have a consensus on what we should ask the passengers, but now can you elaborate on some criteria? For example, if we want to have a survey that is as representative as possible of the population or of the full number of users of the BRT system in the scenario, which should be the conditions or the criteria to apply to conduct the survey?
The criteria could be like it should be you have to be very to done in a very sophisticated manner that when you ask or when you interview the passengers, they don't get irritated or frustrated from you. So it should be like when they are waiting for the bus to come, then you can take the survey, right? Because otherwise he or she will be very quick to board that bus and just go away. So you have to adjust your time. You have to see at what time you can. Time management is the key here, I guess. And if I go about the methodology or the tools, then we see that it should not be done on the gazetted holidays or a weekends, something like that. It should be on the weekdays, so that you can capture the right amount of public opinion and the right volume. I guess these are the two most important things or conditions in there.
Yep, that's absolutely perfect. That's absolutely correct. Just in terms of time, of course, we have to give the interviewers the time to answer the questions. But if we go to, for example, a BRT station during off-peak times, we may not capture the average users profile of the users of the BRT system. So I would say try to conduct the service proportionally to the number of passengers in different during off-peak and during peak hours. That would be one of the conditions. Demographic density characteristics of the concerned area. Yes, of course, that could be one of them. Traffic intensity or volume of the area, transport infrastructure. Yes, that that's absolutely one good criteria to conduct the survey. I would also say the busy stations. If you go to a busy BRT station, chances of capturing more passengers are higher than going to a passenger that is not as busy as others. And last but not least, sample size. In the exercise that I'm going to show you shortly, we are talking about 15 interviews. This is very simple. It's just for this simple exercise. The number of real interviews, if you want to have a reliable and realistic baseline, usually goes beyond 1,000 interviews for each week when the survey is conducted. Another important point, try not to conduct the survey during holidays, of course, because the demand will be completely different. Okay, if there are no other proposals. Yes, Ariel, yes.
Yeah, there's indeed a question about the vintage of data. It's asked, is there a specific timeline for which the transport data to be collected? For example, like past 10 years or past 5 years?
No, to set the baseline for a specific BRT line, for example, you should do you should have the most up-to-date information. For example, if you implemented the BRT last year, you may give a couple of months or a couple of weeks before the system stabilizes in terms of demand and in terms of number of passengers, and then conduct the survey. I would not recommend to do it with more than 1 year after the system entered in operation. Yeah, I have here a comment from Ankit that the methodology, according to the methodology, to the CDM methodologies, there will be between 6,000 and 8,000 samples a week. Yep, depends on the size of the city, but that is not far from a realistic sample size, indeed. Okay, I think then, since we have a bit more than 20 minutes before the end of the session, we could go for the case exercise. Now, I would ask Siap if I can share my screen. And you can also save the dummy questionnaire in the Google Drive. Thank you. Okay, so we agreed on the basic questions. We went on a BRT station to conduct the survey. We interviewed 15 passengers, and that's the result of the survey. We asked about their starting point, their final destination, which should be the distance traveled, and which is the mode of transport travel. And then with this information, we have some enough background to calculate the baseline emissions for the BRT system, meaning if the total number of passengers using the BRT would not have used the BRT, how many CO2 would be emitted in the absence of the line. I have here, you can see the resolution. I will give you, how about 15 minutes to work with this information. I will also share with Ariel, with IGS and GIZ, the resolution, the file containing the resolution and the calculation. But now I'd like you to do some exercise, some Excel calculation. Yeah, then Ariel, can we give 15 minutes?
I would say, because we also need 5 minutes to wrap up, so maybe 10 minutes. Would that work for you? So until 3.
Yeah, that should be fine.
3:50 my time. Kunping, can you upload the Excel sheet to the Google Drive so the participant can download that? Marlan also comments in the chat. Yeah, do you want it to?
I can see here when take survey may also be important. When to take the survey may also be important. For example, persons waiting at the station for bus may be more approachable to take the survey than those deboarding the bus. Yes, absolutely, Marlon. Absolutely, we take their waiting time to ask the questions and get as much information as possible. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Okay, so yeah.
Sorry,
yes,
please. I think you need to upload the Excel, not the PDF file, because they need the formulas to work on the results, correct?
I haven't shared the resolution yet, but I will do it now. I'm sending you right now.
Okay. Okay. Over to you, Eduardo.
Okay, so how about this? We meet back in 10 minutes, and then I can hear some answers and some comments about the exercise. Okay. So see you later then. Ariel, I just sent you and to Shatip the resolution, the file containing the resolution and the calculation.
Yeah, I received that. So Kunping, can you upload the results? George, you have your hand up. Do you want me to take the floor for comments?
Just a question to Eduardo, if I may.
Yes, please.
Hi, Eduardo. Thank you for the informative presentation and excellent exercise. Just a question, a bit on a tangent, sort of in economic analysis in the transport sector, the two factors that are often included in surveys are time and cost. Now so to the traveler. So maybe I realize it's not particularly directly relevant for estimating emissions and setting the baseline, but have you seen that being used at all in kind of making the case for additionality or justifying the need for additional support for a particular project and have those factors included in the survey, or is that something that's really outside of the emission analysis framework?
Thanks very much, George, for the question. Sorry. Perhaps these parameters, they would be relevant on a simulation model that captures the demand of passengers using inputs other than what mode you would have used as a simple questionnaire to passengers. Just talking specifically about the CDM world, Clean Development Mechanism world, no, it's usually stop and approach and ask questions to passenger, and then with the responses from the questionnaire, you calculate the baseline emissions. And additionality, there are some options, again, under the CDM world to set the additionality that could be based on the performance of the system deployed as the project, for example, in terms of grams of CO2 per kilometer traveled or per passenger kilometer, or could be based on investment analysis. And investment analysis from the perspective of the entity implementing the projects, including all the costs of constructions, the cost of operations, and the revenues with the tickets, the fees. Hope to have answered.
Thanks so much. That's excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just adding on that, on the comment from George, I'm just thinking here out loud. The approach usually taken on survey is to approach the passenger and ask the question, but perhaps if some campaigns are deployed where you give the passenger some benefits, some money, or I don't know, a snack or whatever, just to take more of the passenger time to answer the questions with more detail, could be an approach also to conduct the survey. But that's completely open to the entity that has designed and will conduct the survey. Okay, I see that time is up. Just one, can I have a general impression about the exercise? I know it's not quite straightforward. It has, here in this case, has some Excel tools to be dealt with, but could participants capture where they should go based on the answers from the survey, from this dummy survey? Yeah, Ariel, if you can help me with any comments, because I don't have access here to one of the windows.
I don't see any hands up, but I would also encourage participants. Will you be able to share your experience with Eduardo about this exercise? Yeah, I don't see hands.
Okay, then I think we can quickly go through the answer. The goal of the survey is to calculate the emissions based on the ASIF model, the SIF model. The first factor that would need to be determined is the share of passenger kilometers that traveled in the different transport modes. To do that, you first have to sum the answers that passengers provided on a distance traveled by each of the modes. Then you have the information on how many kilometers the vehicle would have traveled with that specific passenger. Now, to transform the vehicle kilometer to passenger kilometer, it's important to have the average occupancy of the vehicle. Now, this can be somehow tricky. There are different ways to determine this information. For my example, I would say go to transport statistics, but there's also the possibility to conduct a specific survey to set the occupancy of these different types of vehicles. And this approach was employed by some project activities in the clean development mechanism. So let's source it from transport statistics. If you multiply the distance traveled by one vehicle by the average occupancy, you calculate the amount of passenger kilometers that were traveling in this specific vehicle. And then it's just a matter of apportioning how many passenger kilometers have traveled in the different vehicle types. You have 4% for car and 93% by bus, and a very small share by bicycle. Okay, so that's the parameter S. We have here S for each type of vehicle. Now the parameter I, which is the fuel intensity of the vehicle. Again, this is something you can capture in the survey, although may be a bit tricky if, for example, the passenger takes a taxi, which is a type of fuel he doesn't have the control over, doesn't know if it's fuel or gasoline or natural gas, whatever. So let's take it also from transport statistics. Let's, sorry, I am one step ahead, sorry. Now, for each type of vehicle, you have to set how many units of fuel are consumed to travel 100 kilometers. You can also ask the participants if you travel by car, which would be the average fuel consumption of your car, or if you travel by motorcycle, would be the average consumption of the motorcycle. By bus gets a bit more complicated because you have to go to the bus operator. So let's assume that everything can be sourced from transport statistics or from the manufacturer of the vehicles. So we have the parameter I set here using external information. Now, next step, calculate the emission factor for the different transport modes. And here, this is a very simple approach. We assume that all vehicles in the survey consume gasoline, all taxis consume gasoline, all motorcycles consume gasoline, and all buses consume 100% diesel, no biodiesel. The density, net calorific value, and CO2 emission factors can be sourced either from the supplier or of the fuel, from national energy balances, or even from the IPCC. So here, let's say that density and net calorific value is information from the supplier of the fuel, and specific and CO2 emission factor from the IPCC. Now, by multiplying the density by the net calorific value by the CO2 emission factor, the result would be the amount of CO2 emitted by consuming 1 unit of fuel, which is 1 liter of fuel, for each of the vehicle modes. And again, this is quite simple because we assume that each vehicle mode consumes only one type of fuel. If, for example, you had car consuming fuel, gasoline plus diesel, then a weighted average would have to be determined here and here. Now, finally, we have S, we have I, we have F calculated above. So for each passenger kilometer traveled, there is an emission in the baseline of around 730 grams of CO2. If there are 100 million passenger kilometers traveling for a certain period, just multiplying this by this gives you the amount of CO2 emitted for this 100 million passenger kilometers. And this would be the baseline emissions. Now, let's say next year you want to redo the survey, you want to update the baseline, you go on site again, you ask the questions again, you will receive some different answers. From here, you update the calculation, you update the emission factor, etc., and you update the calculation. It's costly to conduct a survey. One approach employed by clean development mechanism projects is to conduct a maximum of 3 surveys every 10 years, 2 surveys every 10 years. One at the start of the project, at least 1 year after the line, the BRT or the subway line has entered in operation. The other one at year 4 or 5, and then at year 7, you do the last one. This is just to avoid a very costly process to update the baseline. Okay, I think with this information, you have access to this Excel spreadsheet. Again, this is a very simple survey, it's just to walk through this exercise on what you should ask passengers or users of a public transportation system to calculate the emission factor, and how to calculate the emission factor, applying the ASIF model. And yeah, with that, I'll give the floor back to Ariel. Thanks, Ariel.
Thank you so much, Eduardo, for leading us the hands-on exercise. We received comments in the chat from George, mentioned that it's very helpful. So thank you so much, Eduardo. All right, so we are about to wrap up our session. So I wanted to invite Gaj for a few remarks on the way forward and next step. So Gaj, please take the floor.
Eduardo can go ahead and do that.
Okay,
as
Eduardo,
well.
please.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Ariel, and thanks everyone for attending the session. I think it's quite productive what Marlan presented on what has been decided on COP and the key elements of Biennial Transparency report, and how to include the goals of the NDCs when reporting the emissions. I would strongly encourage to refer to the compendium of greenhouse gas methodologies for setting the baseline and the transport. What I presented here is just one example for public transportation, but the compendium is quite comprehensive. You can see different options for different types of approaches, for cargo, for introducing different types of vehicles, for introducing a policy, etc. Use the tools available to update your options. We are now under the Article 6.4, the market mechanism. As Gaj indicated, we are in the process of updating the methodologies, including the new requirements according to the modalities and procedures set by the CMA. Yeah, I think with that, I give the floor back to Ariel. Thanks very much, Ariel.
Okay, thank you, Eduardo. Indeed, when you're making the final remarks, there's a question about activity data from survey or assumption in the time of operational projects. Will we still able to answer this question?
Yes, can you set the question again, please?
It's in the chat. It's asked, is the activity the data from the survey or assumption in the time of operational project?
No, it's the activity. It's something that is measured after the project is implemented. It's the number of passenger kilometers transported in the project. So the SINF are estimated prior to the project. Are the questions of how this bunch of passengers that I measured, I counted, would travel in the absence of the project. So A is indeed something to be determined during the operation of the line.
Lastly, I still wanted to give the floor to Ankit for the final comment. Ankit?
Hi, yeah. Just want to ask also, you are following ASF model, right? But the methodology is always used to say do the survey now. So where it is typically mentioned that we can use the ASF model or the tier 2 approach for calculating baseline emissions. Can you please help me with that?
I'm sorry, Ankit, I didn't quite get the question. I think there's too much background noise. Sorry.
I repeat. I just want to ask that you are following ASF model, right? Just for instructive purposes, but you are following ASF model, and the methodology usually says that survey is to be done. So can you please specifically confirm me that where the ASF model is mentioned, either in the methodology or any tool, so that I can just have a look on it?
Yeah, on the CDM methodologies, the ASIF model is not fully referenced, but you can see which are the activity and the intensity and the fuel consumption emission factors indicated in the equations. I would say if you go to the 2.8, the last two equations, they contain the elements of the ASIF model, but not SA, not SF, or I or F.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so I would want to just thank all the participants for your very active participation in our session. Of course, also a big thank to our speakers, and particular Eduardo for leading us for a very interesting hands-on exercise. So without further ado, I would just wish all the participants to enjoy the rest of the Transport and Climate Change week. And in the chat, there's also a link to, I think it's a networking session. It's a break time now, so that you please use the link to enjoy the network with each other. So with that, I would just wanted to thank you all again, and wish you have a good day or good evening. Ciao, see ya.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day. Have a nice rest of session.
Thank you.